The 1st of July, 1916, is the bloodiest day in the British Army's long history, when wave after wave of men would go over the top across no man's land, headlong into messes of wire and waiting machine guns. The week-long preparatory bombardment intended to destroy near insurmountable defensive positions had failed. The result was nearly 60,000 casualties. To this day, the accusations fly. Incompetent, stupid butchers. Many people believe that those at the head of the army, chiefly General Sir Douglas Haig, ought to have seen what was happening, ought to have done something to stop the carnage. When they realized the German wire hadn't been cut, that the bunkers hadn't been destroyed, they ought to have called it off. Instead, their stubbornness and lack of imagination resulted in disaster. So goes the popular narrative. But there's more to this story than lions and donkeys. A lot of people seem to hold the view that the Somme should have been called off, or at least that the initial attacks canceled once that first wave went over the top and they realized that the plan wasn't proceeding as intended. The subsequent decisions, it is popularly said, to send wave after wave into the fray constitutes an almost criminal level of negligence and incompetence. I contend, however, that such views are not grounded in the reality of the First World War, but are instead born of an ignorance of military organization and communication, of the scale and means of the First World War, and of the context in which the Somme was fought. Once it had begun, it was practically impossible to stop, and even if it could be cancelled, doing so would have been foolish, even murderous. In this video, brought to you by the Native Oak and made possible by the generous support of viewers like yourself, I want to talk about this idea of calling off an attack, an offensive, and why it wasn't so simple as the films, games, and other popular culture might have us believe. War is never waged in a vacuum. This simple truth is among the most important yet often neglected elements of military history. Even the smallest skirmish has a meaning beyond itself. It is inextricable from the strategic context in which it is placed. Originally, the chief goal of the Somme offensive was to achieve a large breakthrough in the German lines, which were understood to be spread thin and incapable of maintaining a properly flexible defense, as they would be forced to fend off simultaneous actions not just by the French and the British, but also the Italians to the south and the Russians in the east. The timetable for this combined continent-wide assault was disrupted, however, when the Germans launched an attack of their own in February of 1916 on the key French positions at Verdun. Remember that Verdun was so much more than just some fortifications in the line. It was a key position in the French lines, yes, and its loss would be a serious blow to the war effort. Perhaps more significantly, though, was how for many reasons it became, for the French who had already lost significant portions of their territory to the invaders, what Marshal Patron would describe as the moral boulevard of the country. On ne passe pas, they shall not pass, became the rallying cry of France, and over 150,000 Frenchmen would lose their lives in the 10-month-long Battle of Verdun. Meanwhile, as all of that is happening, the British up the line are not just France's chief ally in this war, they are a continuation of the exact same front. If the French collapsed at Verdun, it would be just as much a disaster for the British Army as for their comrades to the south. They had, in that way, no choice but to help their allies, to try and relieve the pressure on the French lines. And as such, the Somme offensive was moved up in the timetable. It would, yes, still aim to win a war-ending breakthrough in the German lines, but that was not its sole aim. There was a much wider and more pressing context than that. And as such, to just call off the attack because its first indications weren't the best, arguably, even if it could save some British Empire lives in the short term, it could very well have spelled disaster for the army as a whole further down the road. To say nothing of the disaster it would spell for their French allies, who incidentally had been doing most of the fighting and most of the dying for the Allied efforts on the Western Front. So in short, for matters political, military, and moral, arguably, the British had little choice but to press on with the Somme offensive. But just because the offensive was brought up in the timetable doesn't mean it was a simple affair of just rescheduling a few attacks and moving a few divisions around on a map. It was a process of organizing, stockpiling, building, and training that took months to complete, which brings us to our second chapter. Something that films, video games, and other popular media typically fail to capture is the scale of warfare. So to properly understand what we're talking about when we describe a World War I offensive, it's important to go over some statistics. The first day of the Somme offensive alone involved some 13 British divisions and 6 French divisions. Maybe that doesn't sound like a lot if you're not familiar with a division, but that amounts to, very roughly speaking, some 300,000 men. That's an impossible number to really comprehend. It doesn't look like this. It doesn't even look like this. If you'll forgive me using a rather silly means to demonstrate the point, it looks like this. And these soldiers weren't just hanging around the lines from the start. The Somme's frontage was only around 25 miles, 40 kilometers or so. Soldiers had to be transferred from all sorts of different fronts. Many of them were transferred actually from fighting in Egypt to build up the numbers necessary for this offensive. Obviously, replacements and recruits are being pulled in from Britain, and imperial troops are flooding in from all around the world. Likewise, though, it's not only infantry, of course. To support the operation, the Royal Flying Corps' headquarters was relocated to the Somme in order to better control the 400-some planes that the British were bringing in for the operation. And then the French had another 200 on top of that thrown into the mix. Now, tanks were only brought in a few months later. They weren't there at the beginning of the Somme. But over 700 massive artillery pieces were used. And leading up to the attack, they would notoriously fire over 1.5 million shells in just 7 days. That's 2.5 shells every second, 13 shells for every foot of the front line. And the craziest thing there is that that's actually pretty mild by First World War standards. Future offensives would get even crazier, right? Over 1 million helmets would need to be supplied to the men. Tens of thousands of tents, with every village for miles around being filled with soldiers. In order to supply all of those millions of munitions and equipment, to say nothing of the regular food and water that these people and horses and plenty of other animals besides would all be requiring, the army would need to construct 55 miles of additional railway to maintain the dozens of trains that were needed every day. Not train carriages, mind you, full trains. And it was expected that when the battle actually began, the number of trains needed every day would go as high as over 100. The trucks as well used to assist those train networks. It's not all trains, trucks too. They're going to consume over 2 million gallons of petrol a month. To say nothing of the horse transport, a significant portion of it was still being, wagons hauled by horses. They're going to likewise need millions of pounds of fodder on a regular basis. And then, of course, to keep all of those wheels and hooves and booted feet moving, miles and miles of roads are going to need to be built and rebuilt constantly. You like duck boards? You're going to see a lot of them. Even whole pipe networks would need to be dug and pumping stations constructed in order to supply the army with water. And that's all just the activity in the rear. That's not all, as nearly 4 miles of new trench works would need to be dug, to say nothing of tunneling underneath the German lines, as some 19 mines up to as large as 24 tons needed to be placed. All of this is to say, and there are plenty of other examples besides, of course, all of this is to say that this was a massive operation. It took extraordinary amounts of materials and labor and every other form of capital you can imagine, right? This was warfare on a scale unprecedented, a scale that takes on a life of its own, the likes of which would constitute not just like a campaign, but probably dozens of full-on wars in earlier days. And this is just one offensive, right? At least according to the Wikipedia page, for example, I found a figure that says during the entire Second Boer War, a conflict that nearly lasted for 3 years, less than 250,000 shells were fired altogether. The Somme saw 6 times that number in a week. And then remember that all of this planning and preparation and staging, it had to be moved up. They moved up the schedule. Most of it's happening, all of this chaotic motion, in just 4 or 5 months. So my point with all of this is to show just how severe a decision it would be to cancel an operation on this scale. Not only psychologically, as, of course, declaring the entire thing to be a failure outright would most assuredly lead to court-martials, to a loss of faith in both the military and political leadership, also, of course, to a breach of trust with your allies whom you promised to provide relief to, but not just psychologically, but materially as well. Like we were saying before, all of that time, all of that expense, it isn't happening in a vacuum. While you're spending those months stockpiling arms, building up infrastructure, well, the enemy, they're going to notice something. They're not going to be silent. Down south, they're hitting the French at Verdun every day. And they're building up their own defenses. They're stockpiling their own arms. They're preparing. And if you don't hit them, well, they're going to take advantage of that. They're going to hit you. If you decide to just outright cancel the entire operation because things didn't go 100% according to plan on the first day, well, suddenly you've just gifted them all of that time for free. You've given them the initiative. So from a strategic perspective, even if you could just call off the offensive or decide to pause for a day or two to redraw the entire map, which it's an awful lot easier on paper than it is in real life, well, it'd still be, I think, a horrible, potentially disastrous, and certainly very costly idea. When I say costly, I don't mean for some corporate fat cat, looking at his bottom line like, oh, we're going to lose all this money. No, we're talking about a total war in which every bit of expenditure needs to contribute towards the greater cause because the enemy is competing with you in the same terms, if that makes sense. All of this is, as well, still assuming that a cancellation would even be desirable at a tactical level, that it would be a good thing to do in order to save soldiers' lives and whatnot. But even there, I don't think that it would be. And to discuss why that is the case, we're going to need to move over to our third section, that of warfare by timetables. As is often the case when we discuss the First World War on this channel, we need to consider the communications technology of the war, which might be said to have not yet caught up with the weapons technologies and the scale at which they were being employed. Now, in the Second World War, you're going to see radio operators carrying comms with them at the platoon or company level, but in the First World War, while radios did exist, they weren't typically able to be carried so easily, nor were they so reliable, and so they only saw very limited use when compared with other things like physical telegraph wire, which could be damaged by enemy artillery or even physically cut, and other means which included visual tools like flares, signal flags, and semaphore. When conditions were right, aeroplanes and observation balloons could be employed for artillery spotting, and for the infantry, right on the front line, riders and runners were perhaps the fastest way to get a quickly written message back to headquarters, as well as, of course, animals such as pigeons and messenger dogs. In fact, if the idea of using dogs at the front is interesting to you, I have a recent video on that topic, which I'll link down below, where I discuss how they were trained and some of the extraordinary feats which they achieved. All of this is why so much of the First World War was fought not by direct orders per se, so much as it was fought by timetables. like a train schedule almost. The artillery shall commence firing at 0500 hours, targeting position A. They shall move up their barrage by X number of yards every 15 minutes. The infantry shall then step off at precisely 0600 hours, reaching the enemy trench 7 minutes later, at which point the artillery should have moved just beyond them to avoid any friendly fire. Oh, friendly fire in the First World War. That is a dark, dark world indeed, but a topic for another day. My point overall here is that all of that organization, employing over 300,000 men across 2 different armies, and coordinating all of these different arms, particularly the artillery with the infantry, but also the cavalry, the sappers and the miners, the air corps, it's all being mostly done by telegraph, by paper, and just people with their watches and a timetable, right? Even in a world with perfect communications. Give these guys high-speed internet access, right? And even still, trying to coordinate all of that is incredibly difficult. Whether we're talking at the battalion, the brigade, division, even army-wide headquarters, these officers would be tasked with maintaining a cohesive picture of what's happening across a 20-some mile front in real time. And to do so, to keep track of all that, they're relying on little snippets of information, individual reports written by every which officer coming in one after the other, potentially out of order if they arrive at all. A battle the scale of the Somme could be going disastrously at the front, but even in the most efficient possible communications chains, it's going to take time for that information to work its way through and to become properly understood at the necessary levels. Battles, the moment they commence, are the most brutal and chaotic forms of free-flowing, dynamic environments. I mean, we all know what they say about the best-laid plans and how well they survive first contact with the enemy. They don't. This is a known quantity in military planning. It has been from day one, or at the very least like day 2 after day 1 was presumably a real disaster, right? Some cavemen thinking that they should put together some sort of a more flexible plan, whatever. This is why reserves exist. It's why junior officers with authority to make independent decisions on the ground exist. And just because, of course, something is going poorly in one sector of a battle doesn't suddenly mean that it's going poorly in another, just as the opposite is true as well. One area of the battle could be a clean sweep, no resistance, they're taking all their objectives, when just a mile or 2 down the road, troops are being bogged down in the worst crossfire imaginable. So, imagine receiving those 2 reports, one after another, and having to make a decision on how you proceed, right? Are you really going to cancel this entire operation of 300,000 people because one specific sector isn't going 100% according to plan? No individual within this massive structure has a complete picture of what is happening immediately outside of their own vision. That is the fog of war, in which these officers are being constantly fed a stream of individual pixels, many of which are outright missing, and they're being told to make a landscape out of them. And keep in mind as well that that's happening even at, a battalion level, right? They're trying to figure out, okay, where are all of our men? Who's dealing with what situation? Are they winning or are they losing, basically? They then take the reports that they put together and they move them up the chain to the brigade level, and then from there up to the division. The division has to figure out, okay, is our entire section, is it going according to plan? Are we going to meet the objectives? Are we not? Well, it's going well over here. It's not going well over there. Okay, well, we'll formulate this report, and then they're going to kick it up again. And then that's when Haig gets it on his desk. Okay, so this division's doing okay. This division's not. Okay, we have to do something over there, blah, 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 blah. It is an extraordinarily complicated scenario. This isn't like one of the movies where the big bad general is sitting on top of a great big hill and seeing everything from a bird's eye view. It's not a video game where we're being fed live statistics at every second, right?
sounding a retreat as well, it's not so easy as clicking the runaway button on your screen. So let's just say, right, for argument's sake, through all of the chaos, for one reason or another, a decision is in fact made to call off the offensive. Enough reports are coming in that things are just not going according to plan, and so the entire thing is just abandoned, right? Haig is saying, oh no, they're going to say mean things about me in the future. I wash my hands of it all. We have to pull back. We'll go back to the drawing board, right? What does that actually look like? Well, those orders to pull back are obviously going to need to reach all of the affected units, which is naturally going to happen piecemeal. So you definitely can't tell all of the orders, just tell all the different groups, hey, get out of there now. You're going to need to give them a specific time for a planned withdrawal. Planning a withdrawal, that's going to take some time as well. Oh, but isn't that just so cruel? Isn't that just telling them to, in this case, wait in a crossfire for no reason? Well, no. It's because there's no alternative. If you have everyone fall back one at a time as they themselves receive the orders, you're opening gaps in your line. The enemy is going to pour through, flank the other guys who didn't get the order yet, or encircle the guys who are falling back too soon. Remember, warfare is never a vacuum. Every part of this operation is entirely reliant on all of the other parts. So again, this is where we face a situation where we get these maddening orders for men to hold your ground at all costs, do not give up any bit of ground, as meanwhile, like, artillery is falling all around them and they're getting mowed down by machine guns, and the guy on the ground is obviously saying, what the heck is going on? I can't do this. And then in another world, right, you have the armies advanced swimmingly well. They've captured all their objectives, and they're like, we got to keep on going. We got to keep this momentum going. Get back to division. What do you mean they're telling us to hold our ground? The enemy's on the run. We have to go and get them. That's the entire plot of 1917, right? It's like they saw the enemy was on the run. They tried to take initiative, but it's like, hold on. There's a wider context at play here than what you can see immediately in front of you. Now, some units, they may never even get the order to withdraw at all. The runner might have broken his leg in a shell hole. Telegraph wire could have been cut. The plane might be grounded due to high winds, and the dog might have been gassed, shelled, and shot 3 times. Honestly, as well, in those conditions, the dog is probably the most likely one to actually make it through with the orders. They were tough. Seriously, go watch that video. It did horribly numbers-wise, but I think it was a really good one. Dogs were very important in the war. They saved a lot of lives as messengers. But anyways, point is that if someone like Haig just decided after a few hours of the Somme, after it didn't seem like it was working out, to just cancel the whole thing, he would effectively be condemning all the guys who already went over the top, and likely many more besides, to useless deaths based off of flawed information. Even if it was possible to call off the offensive, even without the massive strategic, economic, political implications thereof, tactically speaking, it most likely wouldn't make sense to do so. You don't call off a massive attack because by the time you realize you want to call it off, it's already well underway. You're in the thick of it, and there is no magic reset button. Instead, what you need to do is adjust your plan. You recalculate based on the new information you receive. You adapt to the ever-changing situation as best you are then able. But then, why didn't they do that? Why did the generals just keep sending in wave after wave so unthinkingly? Were they stupid? Were they blind and stubborn and glory-hungry, uncaring for the lives of their men? Well, with those questions, we come to our final chapter, that of modern judgments.
It's easy for us today to judge the stubbornness of historical figures because we're so far removed from their experiences. Society demands narrative. We want to view wars in a poetic sense, but history is never so simple or neat as all that. The popular image of unending waves of men walking into machine guns while evil generals sit with their wine and cigars, laughing off casualty figures, is simply wrong. The historiography of the First World War has moved beyond such simplistic views, even if our cultural memory has not. The tactical reality of the war was infinitely more complex than that, and even if something doesn't seem to make sense to us today because of our flawed understanding, they fought the way they did for a reason. They found things that worked, and they did them. Naturally, they needed to experiment with new techniques to determine what would and wouldn't work, but every one of those experiments cost lives. The First World War represented the greatest revolution in quite possibly all of military history. It replaced and made mute principles which had stood for thousands of years. We cannot look to those who are forced to navigate that terrifying new world and decry their lack of absolute perfection in doing so.
A far cry from the popular perception, Douglas Haig was a key proponent of new systems of fighting like combined arms warfare. He and most of his colleagues embraced new technologies, although sometimes in different ways, and were trying to understand how to best employ them in the most effective manners, although again, there were disagreements on how that employment was to take part. But anyone who says that these developments should have been just, such common sense, easy to figure out, any Blackadders out there, they're simply wrong. And they most likely don't appreciate how genuinely complicated and nuanced these matters were on the ground. They're speaking from a flawed perception of the war, not what the sources are actually telling us it was like. In short, if they were placed in Haig's shoes, there would have been an awful lot more death and far less, I think, to show for it. Overall, if someone is asking, why did they just send in wave after wave into the machine guns? Well, it betrays a lack of familiarity with the tactical and strategic situation both. The answer is that the question is flawed. They didn't do that. At every level, from the platoon, again up to the division and everything else, military planning was more thorough and adaptive than that, especially in the British Army. As situations were changing on the ground, plans were changed in an appropriate manner. If an enemy platoon wasn't dislodged from a trench, well, maybe you don't rush it then, but instead you take cover. You use bombs and mortars to clear it out before proceeding. But the exact ways that you do so, maybe rushing it is actually the best choice. There's a genuine line of reason as to why it might be, and sometimes, in fact, it was. Other times, using grenades and bombs is a more accurate period of term, mortars and whatnot, maybe that would be better. Maybe bringing in the field artillery, maybe retreating outright. There are a million different solutions to a million different scenarios. There is no one picture of the First World War. But remember that making any kind of change like that to these highly complicated timetable-based plans, it's very, very difficult, especially as soon as you get to any meaningful scale. It's one thing for a platoon commander to make a decision on the fly. It's quite another for an entire army to suddenly shift direction. Communications take time. Redeployment of men takes time. Altering timetables. You get the picture. If an enemy division is not reported to be in location A, but is instead in location B, well then you don't just charge your troops in all the same. You maybe send in a reserve unit to provide assistance. You send out a message to the guys on the ground and pray that it gets to them on time. But you can't just snap your fingers and everyone immediately knows what to do. You can't just have the artillery swap from one target to another with the click of a button. You can't send the cavalry in and then change your mind mid-charge. You can't send a message to the advancing infantry any faster than a runner can actually physically find them. And if the offensive happens to be a disaster, let's just say in every way, right? Every part of it is just abject failure and it's obvious. Well, still, by the time you realize that, by the time it becomes the case, you can't just go back to the way that things were. The situation has changed. You are now staring down the barrel of a new war, whether you like it or not, that you need to adapt to. So you stick with what you have, You do what you can, you move around units that you're able to, you redraw the timetables to adjust as best you're able to, and you make whatever arrangements you can. But there is no reset button.
Even still, there will always be the armchair generals who claim to know oh so much better than the people who were actually there. They'll get really into the details of it all and say, oh, clearly Haig should have moved the X cavalry to the A position rather than B, and at this time instead of that. Oh, that would have changed everything. But when we make such judgments, whatever their scale, and regardless of how well informed they usually aren't, just saying, well, we do so with the inevitable awareness of history, with the hindsight which was unknowable to those on the ground. Every victory, every failure, people die because of it. They couldn't hit a pause button or call a timeout. They had to make decisions on the spot repeatedly. So be honest with yourself. Understanding everything that we've spoken about so far, if you were in their shoes, would you be so cavalier about making dramatic, sweeping changes to the plans? Where even if you get the smallest thing wrong, if you have the artillery move up just a minute later than they were intended, well, then you'd be condemning thousands to slaughter? Boldness in the military world, it would seem, will be branded by the civilian world and its presumption of expertise as either bravery or butchery, all depending on that almighty hindsight. And on the other hand, I think it's important to keep these considerations in mind whenever individuals condemn a leader for not being bold enough in the face of the enemy and not winning a war outright with one grand action when they might have been hesitant to send men to their deaths when they felt they didn't have complete enough information to justify that cost. How willing would you be to gamble with human lives? What sort of odds do you require before you blow that whistle, sending men over the top? These are difficult decisions. They are never made easily.
We need to understand that at its core, the primary job of a general is not to preserve the lives of their men. It is to win. By the time of the First World War, mechanized warfare effectively created a world of deadly arithmetic where officers at every level are constantly being forced to calculate the number of lives they are willing to risk and even just outright spend for any given position. The answer is very rarely zero. You need to take that trench? Okay, well, it's going to cost you anything from 1 to 500 dead, which is why we're going to have to send in a second wave to leapfrog over the first, because the first is going to be so decimated they're not going to be able to take another trench. So we'll send over another line. They're probably going to have to spend another 250 or so, and so on and so forth. And to decry that reality, hard reality, yes, but reality all the same, to decry it as butchery, as stupidity, not only is that ignorant, it's disrespectful of the nature of those necessary sacrifices. It's seeking to create a tidy external narrative that is ungrounded from its own context. So much of our understanding of the First World War is caught up in the individual experiences of it. And that can be a good thing. I mean, it's what I dedicate most of my career to. Those experiences are incredibly important. They need to be appreciated. They needed to add a necessary human context to otherwise faceless numbers. However, if we just look to, like I said earlier, that account of the guy who's dealing with all the artillery falling around and he receives an order saying, hold your ground, if we only pay attention to that, if we don't give an understanding of those cruel statistics, of the wider context in which those maddening stories are set, well, then the narrative provided by those individual stories will inherently be flawed. Because while you and we care about those individuals, we have to care about them, war itself does not. It can't afford to. And that terrible fact is why ultimately, even if it were physically possible, which realistically it isn't, it simply wouldn't make any sense to just call off an offensive the likes of the Somme just because the initial indications are hinting that it might not be going perfectly according to plan. Because while it may seem like sheer and utter madness to the individual guy who's standing, say, beneath the ladders, listening to the first wave being killed just above him, for the war effort itself as a whole, for the generals who need to consider not merely that one man's life, but those of the hundreds of thousands under their command, there simply is no alternative. My name is Brandon Fischella, and on behalf of the Native Oak, thank you for watching. Visit nativeoak.org to learn about our charity work and our mission to promote the study of military history, as well as to find a free digital library of primary sources, or of course, to purchase my new book, Something Like Philosophy. If you enjoyed this video, I think the book would be of interest to you. As ever, this content is made possible by the generous support of our patrons, and of course, by your viewership. So until the next time, my dear viewer, I am, and I shall remain, your most humble and obedient of servants.
As usual, you'll find the sources that I used in this video, as well as additional reading, all listed in the description down below. If you're interested in this topic, I'd recommend giving some of it a look, and also, of course, to watch some of my other videos on the First World War. In particular, my videos about traffic in trench networks and how the nature of the Western Front made it more like a protracted siege rather than a traditional military front might be of interest to you. As always, they'll be linked down below for you to check out, so I'll see you there.